Well, thank you very much. Gordon, it's great to be here. I came here a couple of years ago, I think, spoke about education on that evening. I would say there weren't quite as many people here that time. Maybe this is a more interesting topic. But the topic for tonight, if a church put on an event on this topic 20 years ago, people would have thought, how strange is that? Why ever they're talking about something so obscure? Because it was something you really didn't hear very much about at all. But times have changed, and now transgenderism, transsexual issues, they're everywhere. You're hearing about them in the media, from all directions. It seems to be coming at us. So as Christians, it's really an issue we need to try to clarify what we think about it. I personally have been trying to clarify what I think about it. I'm not sure a huge number of Christians have thought about it in huge depth. So I've tried to look at what other Christians have got to say and to have a think about it for myself as well. Now, I had to submit my slides on Thursday to have them all ready and waiting. And since then, I've looked through them a little bit when I've been preparing. And I realized, unfortunately, I'd made a spelling mistake in my title page. Can anyone tell me the spelling mistake? Oh, I'm feeling better. No, feeling, sorry?
S missing, transsexual.
2 S's in transsexual. Yeah. I don't feel too bad now, most people missed it. Okay, so I'm going to start off looking at a bit of background to this issue. Why is it that this issue has become such a big thing recently? So I'm just going to take a step back and look at some broader factors in society. Right, sex, sexuality, and gender. What's the difference between them? Well, sex, biological sex, a man or a woman, determined by the chromosomes in your body, expressed in physical differences, genitalia, etc. Men and women. Sexuality is something different. By sexuality, people refer to sexual attractions, what direction your sexual life is going to be expressed in. And finally, we come to gender. Now, gender hasn't got a strict definition, but generally by gender, people would tend to mean male and female as opposed to man and woman. Now, you might think, well, it's the same thing, it's the same thing. But what people are tending to say now is that gender is actually something different. The decision to express yourself as male or female is actually something different than whether you are a man or a woman, than your sex. Now, the government, it's not just a particular political party, all governments, they take my taxes and they pay people in universities to come up with something that's called queer theory. And one of the main so-called insights of queer theory is that sex, sexuality, and gender are completely independent of each other. They don't need to be linked to each other in any way. We shouldn't assume that any particular combination of them is the right one, or is the natural one, is the normal one, is the best one. So for someone from that point of view, if they heard someone saying, oh, I'm getting in touch with my feminine side, they'd say, oh, that's great. Here's someone that recognizes that they've got a masculine and feminine aspect within themselves, and they're recognizing that within them. They'd say you're born into a sex as a man or a woman, but your gender, whether you're going to be male or female, how are you going to live, how are you going to express yourself in terms of masculinity and femininity, is a decision for each individual to make. You might choose one or the other, a bit of both, neither, whatever. It's up to the individual. Now, at this point, you might think, if sex and gender are actually independent of each other, they don't actually have anything to do with each other, it does raise the question, why is there such thing as people who want to change sex? If you think about it, if being a man, identifying as a woman, actually isn't a problem, that's all fine, then why do people experience it as such a problem? Well, I think the reason for that is this: the queer theory, the fundamental principle of it, it isn't actually right. It's incorrect. It contrasts with the biblical view of manhood and womanhood. Now, in the Bible, it presents humans created as men and women, male and female, and that's God's purpose. And there's a reason for that. It produces complementarity. Men and women can join together to form the family unit, to reproduce, and also the differences between men and women are part of what attracts them to each other. Now, having said that, Christians can still acknowledge and accept diversity within the sexes. Now, the line I like to illustrate this with is if a man wants to design dresses, I think that's absolutely fine. If a man wants to wear a dress, then I think that's a different matter. But as Christians, we don't need to have strictly defined stereotypes of what it is to be a man or a woman. But on the other hand, we don't accept that the gender is just something that people choose. Now, what else is there in society that's encouraging this attitude about gender fluidity and has led to the prominence of the transgender movement in our society? Generally, anything that involves any sort of gender bending, if someone's wearing clothes that may think, oh, that doesn't quite seem to fit with their sex, that's quite popular. It's fashionable. If you watch TV programs like The Voice, people like Eddie Izzard, so that you can, Boy George, that sort of thing. It's been popular for decades, but especially now. There's a real admiration even for people who are willing to just push the boundaries like that. The whole issue of homosexuality has challenged assumptions about sex and sexuality. So as it used to be assumed a man would be attracted to women, well, now that's no longer assumed in the same way. And that's contributed to the idea that this is all fluid. There's no set pattern of masculinity and femininity. Now, feminism, I don't want to comment on feminism in general, just one specific point that some feminists make, and that is taking the line that differences between men and women are some sort of problem. Something's gone wrong in society that's ended up with men and women being different. They tend to act differently, they make different choices, etc. And that's seen as some sort of a problem. Another influence in society is what people call the androgenization of society. If you think about it, generally, anything that used to be thought of as something that would be for men, and anything you thought of that used to be generally considered for women, there'll be a trend towards blurring that boundary. I mean, the classic example is quite trivial. The classic example would be, say, that the pink shirt. Okay, men now will wear a pink shirt. 30 years ago, they wouldn't, because pink was seen that was a feminine colour. So it's not that there's any huge significance with that, but this is an illustration. If you look at men's so-called grooming products, men's perfume, etc., it would have been unheard of 30 years ago, whereas now it's become normal. So any distinct differences have been blurred. Another thing going on in society is a big emphasis on diversity, which can be a very good thing. So people might take an attitude, oh, it's wonderful, we've got people of different nationalities, different races, people of different religions, they make different sorts of food, it enriches our society. Isn't it wonderful we have such a great variety of people, it makes life more interesting. And then within that philosophy, the gay rights movement has capitalized on that and saying, oh, well, we're a part of that. Isn't it great that some people are straight and some people are gay? And then obviously it just seems very natural within that for then transgender people, transsexual people to say, oh, well, we're another stripe in this great rainbow of diversity. Isn't it great that there's people like us as well? That's a bit of background why I think it's become such an issue recently. So I'm now going to move on to have a look at what it actually is. What leads people to describe themselves as transgender, transsexual, etc. Now, there's a medical condition that's referred to as gender dysphoria. And what that normally amounts to, it might be, for example, a boy as is growing up might feel that might prefer to play with what we'd normally think of as girls' toys, might not be drawn towards the sort of activities I think boys would normally be interested in, maybe his personality, some people might regard as quite feminine. Sometimes even a boy might trying on girls' clothes when there's an opportunity, he might prefer the company of girls. And then as he grows up into adulthood, maybe sometimes that continues, it often doesn't, and in most cases they grow out of it, but sometimes it will continue into adulthood. It might combine with homosexuality. And then you might find this young man might look at his life and think, virtually every aspect of my life, it doesn't actually fit with what people would normally expect of a man. And almost every aspect of my life, it would make more sense if I was a woman. And so they might start thinking, actually, that they are a woman, or should be a woman, or want to become a woman, or want to identify as a woman. And they feel that would simplify their life. Instead of feeling this tension, that their life isn't matching up to what, for example, a man should be, they start thinking, well, it's not my life that should change, it's my identity as a man that should change. then that type of thinking can lead on to a dislike of a person's own sex characteristics, their genitalia, etc. They'll develop a distaste for them, and they wish that they were different. And that can lead to a desire to change gender or to change sex. It often passes, but it can become a very serious long-term problem that dominates someone's life. It really is the central factor of the person's life, overshadowing the whole of their existence, causing huge distress and unhappiness and various other secondary psychological problems. This is almost always unwanted. People wish it was different. They wish it would go away. They wish they could resolve it, but find themselves unable to do so. Proportion of the population that this affects, in the past, research has shown about 0.01%. That's very rare, very rare. But I think that's going to change. As we're in a society that's encouraging people, positively encouraging them to think about this and to consider whether they might want to class themselves as transgender, I think the numbers are going to go up and up. Now, the name gender dysphoria is quite a recent one. This condition used to be called, what I think was a more suitable title for it, gender identity disorder. Now, you can see why that went out of fashion, can't you? That's implying that if you're a man and you think you should be a woman, then there's something wrong. Something's gone wrong in your development. Things are not the way they ought to be. But you can imagine people might say, oh, I'm quite offended at that suggestion. You can think about it similar to years ago, homosexuality would be classed as a disorder by the medical profession, but certainly not anymore. And this is going the same way. So instead of gender identity disorder, which I think is a very accurate description, we've now moved to gender dysphoria, just unhappiness with your gender. The new trend now is towards it not being classed as any sort of medical or psychological condition at all. And that's where we're heading towards now. Should have said at the beginning, if you do want to ask a question during the talk, do feel free to do so, particularly if something hasn't made sense. If you think I haven't made something clear, or you're not sure where I'm coming from, do chip in and ask a question. Otherwise, there'll be lots of opportunity for questions afterwards.
Well, you said in the previous screen that there was this desire to change gender or to change sex.
Yes.
Could you explain, because actually
Yeah,
I understand that they want to change sex, the physical side of it, because already they think they are of a different gender already.
yeah, but I actually come on to that. If that's in a future slide, I'm going to cover that. If I haven't covered it, shout up, and I'll come to that again. Okay, so what causes gender dysphoria? There's one popular theory that you're most likely to come across in the media, and that is that when the baby's developing during pregnancy, there's an early phase where the sexual characteristics of the body develop, and then there's a later phase where the masculinization or feminization of the brain takes place. And the theory is that sometimes there's a mismatch between the two phases. So the first phase might make someone a boy, but then the second phase might make their mind, their brain, more feminine. Now, the great thing with that theory is it's so easy to understand, and it's the sort of thing you can hear and say, I get that. I can understand that. That makes sense. I like that. The only problem with it is that there's no evidence that it's actually true. None at all. But you'll find that repeated again and again and again. There have never been any brain differences measured in children. They have looked at brain differences in adult transsexuals, but the results don't confirm this theory at all. By the time they're looking at the brains of transsexuals, they've often had quite intensive hormone treatment, and your behavior and your thoughts also influence the physical makeup of your brain. So that could be what's been measured. So the brain development theory, very popular. You can see why. It fits a certain agenda, but there isn't actually evidence for it. Well, what other causes might there be? There are various psychological and social factors that people consider might be relevant, and the research has shown that they correlate with gender dysphoria. Don't necessarily cause it, but they tend to be present where gender dysphoria develops. Now, the first one, I found that very interesting. Where you've got parents who wanted, for example, wanted a girl but have a boy, that is a risk factor for the development of gender dysphoria. I assume that must be because of the attitude of the parents and their response towards the child. Parental indifference or encouragement. What that's about is if a parent finds that, generally I'm going to use boys as the example through this, just to keep it simple. For example, if they find a boy who wants to play with dolls, for example, if the parents just think, okay, fine, not going to say anything about it, leave them to it, that would be parental indifference. Encouragement would be to say, oh, that's fantastic, let's take you to the toy shop, we'll get you some new dolls. Or if we wanted to say, dress up as a princess. Some parents might think they're very open-minded and enlightened and say, oh, that's wonderful, we'll buy you a princess outfit for your birthday. If parents are like that, that is a risk factor for developing gender dysphoria. Now, I don't know about you, you might have seen interviews on the television where they'll be speaking to someone who's transsexual or transgender, and they'll say something like, when I was growing up, this is what I was like, and they'll say, but my parents were great. They didn't have any problem with it, they just encouraged me in it, they were really cool with it. They were really good parents, would be the sort of message coming through. Well, the research suggests that might not actually, well, that isn't the case. The parents who take that approach make it more likely that this is going to develop into a problem. Extreme physical closeness with boys, not obviously, hugging whatever's fine, but really taking that to an extreme can be a risk factor. Lack of male role models, emotionally distant fathers, parental psychiatric issues, and the last one, emotional, physical, and sexual abuse is a significant risk factor for developing gender dysphoria. Again, for those people who try to claim that this isn't actually a problem in any sense, it's not a medical condition, well, if a risk factor is emotional, physical, and sexual abuse, and that suggests very strongly to me that all's not well with it. Now, just to summarize about causes, the basic answer is what causes gender dysphoria? We don't know. We don't know how the brain works in any case. Out of all the aspects of the brain, sexuality is pretty well a complete mystery to science, and gender dysphoria is just a mystery within a mystery. So really no one knows how it comes about. These are just some pointers. Okay, so the person who finds themselves with gender dysphoria, how do they take that forward? What are they going to do? One option is to change your identity, to declare yourself to be gender fluid, to declare yourself to be female, to declare yourself to be, some people say, two-spirit, as if there's a male and a female aspect to me. And these identities, there's something like, is it 71 of them to choose from on Facebook now when you register your account? So that's one option, to change your identity. Some people might want to change their name. And that's something that can be done without huge difficulty. There's no barrier to that. You might want to register yourself as someone of the opposite gender, which now is quite a straightforward thing to do. It used to be a lot more difficult, but now it's quite straightforward. I understand it's coming in Scotland that anyone aged 16 and above, basically just by an administrative process, you can register yourself as the opposite gender. Someone might want to reflect it in the way they dress. They might dress ambiguously, or might actually cross-dress, might wear clothes distinctly associated with the opposite sex. They might do that in private, so they feel some sense of relief to this tension between their sex and their gender, or they might go on to do that in public. People look at various cosmetic things, shaving legs, makeup, etc., etc. So people try and do things to make themselves, hairstyles, to make themselves look like the opposite sex. Another option, going to more medical things, more invasive things, taking hormones, which have a physical effect on the body, will tend to make people appear more like the opposite sex, and they also have an effect on the mind as well. That's not well understood at all, but it can change the way the brain functions. Again, can change people's personality a little bit towards what might be more associated with the opposite sex. Then the end of the road is surgery. Now, surgery can take many forms. Some people have surgery, for example, to remove the Adam's apple, because that's a sign of being a man. So some people have surgery to remove it. Surgery to change your voice. Some transsexual men, they realize that their voice doesn't sound like a woman, so they'll have surgery on their vocal system to change that. And then the ultimate one, of course, is a genital reconstruction, where they actually try to change the makeup of the genitalia to simulate the opposite sex. Now, what I've talked about so far in terms of gender dysphoria, it's probably sounded quite familiar to you in the sense that you've thought, yeah, I've heard a bit about that. I've heard people telling you their stories. I felt like a man trapped in a woman's body, and I felt I identified as a woman, and I needed to resolve this conflict within myself to be who I really am. That sort of line. That's what you normally hear from transsexuals, from transgender people. But there's another type as well that's very significant. I would describe this as the trade secret of the transsexual movement, because it's very well known within academic literature, but it doesn't make it into the popular media at all. And it's called autogynephilia. And the way of thinking about that, instead of it being, for example, a woman trapped in a man's body, some people describe it as a man trapped in a man's body. Just out of interest, has anyone ever heard of this at all? Yeah, okay. This would normally apply to, it's only to men, that there's no female equivalent, it only applies with men. Men who would grow up would be unexceptional boys. They're into all the usual boys things. They would go into adulthood heterosexual, might well be married, might well, their career choices, etc., would all seem to match up with typical masculine things. There might be an Olympic athlete, for example. But then later in life, the other sort of transsexuals tend to be earlier in life. Later in life, they might want a sex change. And the reason for that is that their sexual desire for women distorts somehow into a desire to actually become a woman. So while admiring, idolizing, desiring women turns into, with some way that no one understands within the mind, it turns into a desire to be a woman. And these men are sexually stimulated at the thought of being a woman. So following from that would become cross-dressing, fantasizing about any aspect of womanhood, even the most trivial and strange ones. They'll fantasize about being a woman, and that will be sexually stimulating. Now, that description is what we would normally think about with transvestites. And a lot of transgender people involved in the transgender movement, they're horrified that the transvestitism would be related in any way to transsexualism. But the fact is, it is related very closely in many cases. Now, why do we not hear so much about this? There are lots of reasons. There are a lot of people who've said, this is my story. This is why I wanted a sex change. This is why I had a sex change. And now I've had the sex change, I'm sexually aroused by my own experience of being a woman. And they've been very open about that. But that's a much more embarrassing thing to admit to. It's a lot more stigma attached to that than saying you're a woman trapped in a man's body. And the other factor is, if you are an autogynephilic transsexual, you're trying to get the operation, you're trying to get approved for sex reassignment surgery. If you go to the doctor or the psychologist, people know the story you're supposed to tell, and it's the standard story. And they know if they tell this story instead, they'll be rejected. So people tell the story that people want to hear. Now, you may think at this point, well, how do I know these people are lying? Why do people think they know people's real reason as opposed to what they're saying is the reason? And that's a very good question, but there's been research done in this area by a chap called John Blanchard in the 80s, and Anne Lawrence, someone called Anne Lawrence, who was actually a man and had a sex change to become a woman. She's an academic and a doctor looking into this area. And they've done research where they've taken transsexual men who are heterosexual, and they've said to them, are you sexually stimulated at the idea of a sex change? And they'll say, no, that's not it at all. But there are scientific ways of measuring sexual arousal, and they demonstrated that in pretty well every single case, they actually were. And that was actually a factor there in it. Now, this very strange phenomena of a sexual desire for something becoming a desire to identify as or to actually become that thing, it's very strange, but there's other examples of it as well. You may have seen in the news a while ago, I think it was a chap in his 50s, saying he identified as a 6-year-old girl and wanted to dress up as a 6-year-old girl, and there were pictures of him prancing around in a little dress. There are also examples of paedophiles who gain sexual stimulation by dressing up in children's clothes, and they fantasize about the idea of being a child. Similar thing happens with animals. Even to get more bizarre, some people have it with like teddy bears. They have some sort of fetish for teddy bears. They fantasize of being one. They'll dress up as one and fantasize about being a teddy bear. Now, as if that's not weird enough, sometimes it's with amputees. Some people develop a sexual attraction to amputees, and that morphs into a desire to have a limb amputated. I mean, there's very, very strange effect that can happen. So that only applies to male to female. Some of the research indicates that maybe even a majority of male to female transsexuals are autogynephilic, and that's the motivation for it. It's maybe about 60-40, but it's hard to be sure. Okay, when people go through this process towards a sex change, how does it go? How does it work out in the long term? Well, it's quite hard to research because there are so few people who have sex changes that when you try and follow up, you send them the questionnaire, you try and get in touch with them to see how it's gone, you might only get a 50% response rate. Some of the people who are responding, transgenderism, transsexualism, it's a philosophy that guides their life. And so they're not necessarily the most unbiased reporters as well. And also, when you're asking people effectively, did you make the right decision in having sex reassignment surgery? With any question like that, people tend to answer in the way that puts themselves in the best light. So people tend to be reluctant to say, no, I made a terrible mistake, and it's turned out very badly. So what do we know about it? Certainly there are a lot of people who have sex reassignment surgery who go on to regret it. So there's a website, I think it's called Sex Reassignment Surgery Regret. It's full of accounts of people who are saying it didn't provide what they hoped to provide, it didn't solve their problem, they're still very unhappy, and they wish they'd never done it. But looking at the hard data, for example, suicide rates of people who've had sex reassignment surgery are very, very high, 30, 40, 50 times the population. Rates of depression, anxiety, social problems, also very, very high. Now, we need to be careful thinking about that, because these people things were not going brilliantly for them before they entered into this process. So we need to be careful of concluding that it made it worse, but I think there's certainly very strong evidence that in many cases it doesn't make it better, and it does lead people to despair in many cases. Often the problems emerge later. If you see research that says, oh, we followed up people who've had sex reassignment surgery, and only 2% of them said they weren't delighted with the results. That might be 2 years later. It's after 10 years onwards that the real problems start coming through. Another issue with people who've had sex reassignment surgery is what they call passing. So if you're a man who's had sex reassignment surgery to become female, can you pass? Can you convince people that you are actually a woman? And it tends to be quite a difficult issue. Because let's say you think you can't. Then imagine living like that. You've decided to identify yourself as a woman, present yourself as a woman, and yet you think that everyone you meet can actually tell that you're not, or you suspect that they're not. I mean, imagine the pressure of that. I mean, that would color every conversation, every relationship, every introduction to a new person. And transsexuals report that that's very, very difficult to cope with. And the other thing is on the other side, let's imagine a transsexual who thinks they can pass. They think they can convince people, for example, that they're a woman. They think they're entirely convincing. Then you have a different problem. Your problem is fear of discovery. Because no matter how convincing you think you are, a lot of transsexuals report that they're terrified that somehow or other it's going to slip and people are going to find out. And they worry about the stigma and embarrassment about that. Also, lots of transsexuals do report that they feel as if, for example, they're not a proper woman. They can never be a proper woman. They thought having the sex change would mean that they would feel like they'd become a woman, but then they find that they don't feel that they still don't feel that they are actually a woman in the fullest sense of the word. In other aspects, sexual relationships become very difficult for people who've had sex reassignment surgery, and their professional experience is often very difficult as well. With professional relationships, people often find themselves moving from job to job to job following sex reassignment surgery. So that's the issue, gender dysphoria. That's the way some people choose to deal with it, going towards sex change. So how can we respond to this issue? Well, one way that people respond to this issue, I already mentioned, is within a diversity philosophy. Isn't this wonderful? We've got different sorts of people, different sorts of experience and existence, and we think that's just great. So we're really glad that there's transsexual people. And come and join our march, and we'll say it's all great. And this diversity framework is definitely not an illness. It's not a health problem at all. It's just a different type of person, and that's great. It may be unusual, but it's not abnormal. So you might say, well, why are transsexual people so unhappy? Why are the suicide rates so high? People within this framework would say, well, it's transphobia. It's because people in society treat them so badly that they're driven to these extremes. Okay, that's the diversity framework. As a Christian, I don't accept that framework at all, but that's the dominant one in society. How else to respond? That's to look at it as a mental health problem. Now, as with any health problem, how do you respond to it? With compassion, with treatment, with support? Now, that's an approach to it that I can accept. And that's an approach that many people who are not Christians, might have a very different view, could also accept. Someone could accept this approach and think that sex change surgery is the best treatment. Some people could accept this approach and say they don't think that's the best treatment. But to treat it as some sort of mental health problem, I think is something that we can agree with the medical profession and a lot of people about. Well, moving to something a bit more specifically Christian, we can look at this issue from the point of view of integrity. Now, I talked at the beginning a little bit about God's design and God's intention. So if you're dealing with someone with gender dysphoria, from this perspective, what you'll be aiming at is reconciliation between biological sex and gender, to bring things into alignment, to bring things the way they ought to be, to bring things the way that God intends them to be. So within this framework, the approach would be to discourage steps to identify with the opposite sex and to encourage activities that bring things into alignment with their existing sex. Within that approach, as I said, you can accept huge diversity within manhood and womanhood. We don't have to have a strictly defined stereotype of what a man is and what a woman is. But there are some things that are distinctly symbols and signals of manhood and womanhood, and we'll try to bring those into alignment. So we're trying to solve the psychological problem by bringing the thinking into line with the biological sex, rather than trying to bring the biological sex into line with the mind. Right, one last way to approach it would be to look at the issue of sin. Now, I think for the gender dysphoria category, I don't think this is relevant at the core of the issue. For the autogynephilic category, where some campaigners describe it as a sexual orientation, a sexual attraction towards the idea of yourself being a woman. Now, I think the Bible's quite clear that not every sexual orientation, not every sexual desire is right. There are some sexual desires that are out of line with God's created intention, and no matter how strong they are, then it's not going to be good to go down in that direction or to act on them. And ultimately, it's going to lead to harm. Even though it might seem to offer some sort of relief in the short term, in the long term, it's going to lead to harm, obsession rather than fulfillment. So how do we respond to sin? Compassion, exhortation, explaining our view. We'll come on a little bit more to that later on. But just going back to the idea of sex change, in our society, it's generally taken for granted that you can have medical procedures done and that results in a person changing sex. But is that actually true? Can a person actually change sex? Your sex is written in every cell of your body in the chromosomes. So in that sense, that can't be changed. When I thought about this, I thought about a little thought experiment where we can just imagine a situation and it helps us to clarify what we think about it. If you imagine the situation where you had a man, a husband, a father, who was, say, kidnapped, and he was forced to undergo sex reassignment surgery, all the treatments over a year, and then he escaped and went back to his family. Now, if you imagine that man going back to his family, and his wife said, "Oh, this is wonderful, my husband's back," and the kid said, "Oh, Dad, it's fantastic, you're back with us." Would anyone really want to step in there and say, whoa, 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 hang on a minute, this is not your dad anymore. He's not a man anymore. This is not your husband anymore. He's got to be your wife. He's another mother. Would anyone really do that? I don't think anyone really would. And I think that shows us that we don't really believe that these procedures change someone's sex. Certainly to me, it makes that clear. I don't think we believe they change someone's sex. People's experience when they talk about this is often that they feel like they were chasing an impossible goal. They thought they could change sex, then eventually they realized they couldn't, and that's often the despairing thought that can end in suicide. So in offering sex change, are we encouraging people down a road that ultimately is a quest for an impossible goal that's always going to end in frustration? The other issue with this, I personally don't believe that it's possible to change sex. But that can prevent some very difficult practical questions. I haven't come across them practically yet, but it could happen. So if you meet someone who is transsexual, I mean, it's now the law that you have to refer to them in the way that they want to be referred to. And yet, I would feel that in doing that, I'm effectively lying. And I think that's quite difficult. There's a state in America where they've made the penalty for refusing to call someone, for example, her, when you think it's actually a him. The penalty is $250,000 maximum fine. They're just not going to have it. I think in Britain as well. But in your workplace, if you took that line with someone, you'd be in serious trouble. So that's an issue I would have to grapple with when it came along. Even to call someone, for example, a female name, when you feel that that's deceitful, you feel that it's not reflecting the truth. But the pressure in society is to force people, to force everyone to accept the truth of changing sex, that is not allowed to believe that people can't actually change sex. And I think there'll be stories coming through in the next few years where people get into hot water over this in Britain. So is sex reassignment surgery ever justified? One person, this is an infamous quote, it's very unpopular among the transgender movement. Someone once said that sex change surgery is like liposuction for anorexics. So you can see the analogy. An anorexic might say, "Oh, I'm really overweight, where actually they're really skinny, they're not overweight. And the solution to anorexia is to help people to see that they're not overweight and they need to eat. Whereas offering liposuction, that would be assuming that their delusion that they're overweight is true and undergoing surgery that corresponds to the delusion. And the idea is that sex change surgery might be analogous to that in some ways, that you're trying to make what might be described as a delusion into the mind a reality in the body, instead of trying to deal with the delusion in the mind and leaving the body as it is. So how to think about this issue? Again, I tried to see what various Christians were saying. I didn't find a huge amount, so I had to think about it for myself. Are there any other situations that could help me to think about this? One of them is a body integrity identity disorder. This is the very, very rare thing where people feel, for example, that their right leg doesn't belong to them. And they're very distressed, depressed, and that they beg for their right leg to be cut off because they're so distressed. And obviously doctors and psychiatrists would try to help people with that. But sometimes the people just don't seem to be able to respond, and they're so unhappy, it's ruining their life. And eventually, doctors will say, well, okay, we'll go ahead. And there is actually, apparently, there's a surgeon in Scotland who will actually cut off perfectly healthy limbs for psychological reasons. Now, what do I think about that? I think about that, if you've tried all else, then I can accept that that could be the right course of action. How does that translate to sex change surgery? I think it's very different. If you, say, had your leg cut off to relieve a psychological problem, you're not deceiving anybody. You're not deceiving yourself. You're presenting yourself, you're saying, look, I had this problem in my mind, I've had this surgery to solve it, and I've solved the problem. That's my story. You're presenting yourself at face value. The difference with sex change is that you're presenting, in my view, you're trying to present a deception from that point of view, which brings a moral aspect to it that's different. And a lot of transsexuals talk about that, the integrity issue. They feel as if they're living a lie, trying to live in the opposite sex. But again, I was also thinking about it in terms of responding to people with delusions. If you imagine you had someone, let's say a senile person, they believe they were Winston Churchill, and you go and visit them, and they'll say, how are the plans going for D-Day? And you'll say, no, I'm your son. Do you not remember me? You're not Winston Churchill. And when you do that, they just get really upset. And eventually you think, oh, there's no point. I'm just going to go along with it. I'll play along with the game. That's how they're happiest. And that's the best way I can care for them and support them in this state. Is that acceptable? Well, I think it is. In some situations, that might be acceptable. How does that translate to sex change surgery? Is it similar? If people are so convinced of a delusion, eventually do we get to the point where we think maybe we'll just go along with it? Again, I think there's an important difference here. Sorry, I just lost my train of thought. The important difference is the person who thinks he's Winston Churchill, we're treating him as if he's beyond reasoning with. He's lost the capacity to critically analyze his own thoughts, and we deal with him on that basis. For the transsexual person, I think they're not in that situation. We shouldn't treat them as though they haven't got the capacity to critically examine their own thoughts. So is sex reassignment surgery ever justified? Everything I've read from Christians, at the very least, says in dealing with people with gender dysphoria, we should try to minimize people's steps down the road towards hormone treatment or sex reassignment surgery, for people to do the minimum in that direction. But in the most extreme case where people are so distressed and so desperate to have sex reassignment surgery, is it okay in extremis in those cases? Probably the most popular book on the subject around at the moment is this one, Understanding Gender Dysphoria, Mark Yarhouse. It's very, very good, very influential. His final conclusion is that in the most extreme cases, the distress someone's experiencing is so severe that he would accept that that might be the best thing to do in that particular case, even though it might discourage it. The Christian Medical Fellowship in Britain has taken a similar line. I think it's taken it basically from Yarhouse's book. My personal view, I think I'm more inclined the other way. I would find it difficult to see that ultimately good is going to come from something that's so flawed and is based on a lack of integrity. So I would veer towards saying I don't think it's ever a good direction to go in. Okay, children. Gender dysphoria issues in childhood. I say 85% of the time they resolve themselves naturally, and it's not an issue going into adulthood. But that could well change with the way children are treated now. Children are positively encouraged to assess themselves, to consider their gender, to question their own gender, to declare themselves to be transgender or anything else. And I think that's going to have a significant effect in the future. Those of you who've got children in school, there will be a PSHE program, Personal, Social and Health Education, and I would encourage you to find out exactly what your children are taught on this topic at school. I've seen leaflets that have said things like, if you're a boy and you don't really like sport and you quite like arty things, maybe you're transgender. I mean, absolutely outrageous. So as parents, I would almost encourage you to fear the worst in terms of what your school, your children's school, might be presenting to your children. Stonewall, the gay rights organisation, functioning virtually like a government department, they issued guidance to primary schools recommending that you have a dressing up corner, including dresses, so boys can experience wearing dresses. Okay? Which is clearly a risk factor for developing gender dysphoria. Okay, so that's harming children. These people are taking an approach which is going to damage children and lead to very negative consequences for them in the longer term. Going to a children's bookshop, teenage section of the bookshop, you'll see a smattering of books about transsexualism, promoting transsexualism. The most popular, probably The Boy in the Dress. Has anyone seen that? David Walliams. It's just utterly bizarre. It's about a boy who's introduced to cross-dressing by a female friend. It describes how it was really nice putting the girl's clothes on, and he really liked doing it, so he did it more and more. Then he started doing it at school, and then everyone picked on him. But then everyone at school became enlightened and realized it was absolutely fine and normal and healthy, so he wore a dress at school. His headmaster was the real baddie, but then it turns out his headmaster was a cross-dresser at the weekend as well, and that's the story. But, is that in the library in your local school, in your children's schools? Very, very possibly. Very possibly. When's it going to come out as a little film on the BBC or something? Wait and see. Then the Science Museum recently, children's section, sex and gender. You're born as a boy or a girl, but no one can choose your gender for you. Science Museum, as if that's science. Even more concerning is the trend now is if a child is showing signs of gender dysphoria, then the advice to them can be to start hormone treatment to delay puberty. The thinking being, it gives them time to make up their own mind before their body starts developing in one direction or another. These puberty blockers, these hormones, people don't really know their effect on the physical development of the body, they don't know the effect on the mind, and they don't know the psychological effects of this approach. But it's been driven by ideology, and it's at a school near you. And the number of prescriptions of this is rocketing, absolutely rocketing. It's multiplying year by year. Say if you've got any concern about what sort of advice young people might be receiving in a secular context, I'm afraid I would say probably fear the worst of what they're hearing. I mean, this basically amounts to experimenting on children for the sake of an ideology. The effects are unknown. Where children do identify themselves as transgender, I was talking to someone the other day who just moved from another school in Edinburgh. They said they'd got 4 children in the school who identified as transgender. What normally happens then is that the boys don't want to play with them, the girls don't want to play with them. And they end up horribly isolated and extremely unhappy. And of course, the official line is you have to blame that on transphobia, whereas I think it's just a natural effect of children's response to the issue. Right, last slide. What's the Bible got to say? I've talked about some Christian teaching at various points through it. Male and female, as God's designed for humanity, that men and women are complementary, And they bring together different qualities attracted to each other to create the family. Right, I sometimes think Christians are a bit too clever for their own good when it comes to looking at the Bible. And they'll tend to say, oh, you shouldn't just look at individual verses. You need to look at the whole themes running through Scripture, which is true. That's very true. But on the other hand, an individual verse can also have something to say. Otherwise, God wouldn't have put them there. Deuteronomy 22, verse 5 says a man shouldn't dress in women's clothing, a woman shouldn't dress in man's clothing. Now, the reason for that, you could speculate a little bit about that, about the reason for it. My inclination would be just to take that at face value, that's something just applies, that's God sharing his mind on this matter. But something in the Old Testament, if we're not quite sure, what do? We look at what's in the New Testament. Is there any parallel in the New Testament? Well, there is. 1 Corinthians 11:14 talks about hair length, which you could say is a cultural thing at the time. But however you interpret that, it's very clearly saying it's not right for men to have the cultural marker that would be associated with women and vice versa. So I think that very definitely is a theme in the Bible as well. In terms of sexual orientation, I mentioned already, the fact that someone develops a sexual attraction to something doesn't mean that it's in any way morally acceptable or is in any way in alignment with God's intention. I think that applies to autogynephilic transsexuals. Right, the last three, compassion, obviously. What we're dealing with here is people, in many cases, with extreme psychological distress. This is the major dominating feature of their life, and it's a huge problem with it, and they're desperate to find a solution for it. So we need to respond to the issue with compassion, no matter what a view of the various ways forward. These are people with a very serious problem, or in the case of autogynephilic transsexuals, addiction that they're trying to deal with. Right, the Holy Spirit. We believe that the Holy Spirit can work in people and can change them. And the way the Holy Spirit changes us is brings us into alignment with God's intentions for us, makes us the people we want to be. I think that's true on every level. It's true on a physical level. It's true on a psychological level as well. That obviously doesn't mean that the same as every physical problem isn't taken away by God, every psychological problem isn't taken away by God as well. But we expect, as someone comes to know Christ, walks with him, we'd expect the Holy Spirit to be at work in them. And this would be an area where we would be faithful and be expecting God to work in someone's life to bring resolution. The last thing is the church community, as well, is a hugely powerful thing. When you've got people who are feeling they don't fit in anywhere, so they might be led to the only place where they do feel they fit in is within the LGBT movement or a transsexual group, and that can be quite isolating, that can compound problems. Church community should be open to anyone, and it should be a place where people might feel they're not accepted in other places, they're expecting rejection, but then find in the church community that it's different, that there's warmth, there's acceptance, there's support. Now, obviously, there's a tension there, because a lot of people who might be transsexual, transgender, they would take great offense at some of the things I've said. So there's the tension there. But in terms of the way we relate to people, we can still be welcoming. And the other important thing to get over, as in with so many aspects of Christian morality, people will try to see it that we're being nasty to people, we're attacking people. Because we've got these beliefs, we're trying to stop them doing what they want to do, stop them fulfilling their lives, entering into their destiny, etc. Whereas what we're actually doing is we're trying to share wisdom and say with people, look, this is really what we think is best. This is the path that we think is what God wants as the creator, and this is what we think is going to work out for the best for you. Right, that's the end of my presentation. So I would, thank you.